Hello and welcome to another tier list video. Today we are taking a look at programming languages. Now for many of you who don't know, I work full-time as a software developer, so I feel like I have a decent amount of experience to give a ranking for each of these languages. I'm not going to be ranking them based on how useful I think they are, just how much I enjoy programming in them, because obviously every single language has its own pros and cons and their own use cases. So I'm just going to be ranking them, based on how much I like them, my experiences I've had with them. All the ones on this list I've used quite extensively. There are some other languages which I have used here and there, but I don't feel like I've really written in them enough to give a solid ranking with them. So starting us off, we have C, one of the classic languages. Spent so much time in school writing in C. So many of my courses like systems programming, operating systems, all our assignments had to be in C. And let me tell you, I did not enjoy it. One of the first languages which I really sat down and really learned a lot was C++. And I really like C++. You can do a lot of different things. It's super flexible, super powerful, super quick. And C, you can do most things in C that you can in C++. There definitely are exceptions, but just functionally, you can do most of the things in C that you can in C++. That being said, it's oftentimes much easier to do in C++. There's a lot of headaches that they take out in C++. And there's a lot of things that you can break much easier in C. So honestly, I'm not a huge fan of C. While I understand, it's really powerful, you can do a lot. As somebody who goes from C++ back to C, it's kind of like going from, a nice luxury vehicle to an old crappy vehicle that breaks down and sometimes tries to kill you. So for those reasons, C, this might upset some people, but it's going to be in the C tier. No pun intended, but honestly, C, I'm not a huge fan. There's just too many things that it doesn't have that C++ it does have that I miss. And trying to go back to C, it's just so painful. I almost always use C++ because I really can't think of anything I've ever done in C that I couldn't do in C++ easier. So for those reasons, C gonna find itself, I would say rightfully so, in the C tier. Up next, C++. You heard me just singing its praises. One of the first languages that I really sat down and learned a lot. I really enjoy C. It's just a super simple, super quick language. Like, it's not super verbose like something like Java or sometimes C#. Everything is really quick and concise and super flexible. You can do a ton of stuff, you can do anything you want with pointers, memory, really easily. So C++, one of my favorite languages to write in, and gonna find itself in the S tier. Up next, we have C#. Now, while I would say C++ and C are relatively similar, even just in terms of looking at the code, there's a lot of similarities. C++, C#, really not so much the case. C# I would say is much more similar to Java than it is C++. But I really enjoy C#. As somebody who's spent a lot of time writing in Java and C#, I think C# is actually a really good language to start with for a lot of people. Some people start with C, some people start with C++. I personally recommend actually starting with C#. I think it's pretty easy to get started with. It's not quite as verbose in terms of like function names and doing things as Java. I think it's really simple, and with C# you can really easily work with the .NET framework, make a lot of cool stuff with that through Microsoft's Visual Studio. So overall, C#, absolutely love it. I really have no complaints about C#. Even if you want to do something with pointers or memory, you can do it in C++. It's not quite as simple and straightforward because there are some more constraints that kind of help prevent you from killing your computer. But C#, I overall just really like it. Gonna find itself in the S tier as well. Up next, we have Visual Basic. Now, this is one that I fortunately have not really had to work with for quite a while now, but I did do a decent amount of work in the past. But Visual Basic, I really do not love it. I would compare Visual Basic to C#, like C to C++. You can do a lot of similar stuff in Visual Basic in terms of the stuff you're usually looking to accomplish in C#. That being said, in Visual Basic, it's usually just more annoying to do, and significantly more annoying. And even just the code structure, the syntax that you use in Visual Basic, I'm really not a fan of. So overall, Visual Basic, not a huge fan. I would never use this by choice at this point unless I was required to, so Visual Basic gonna find itself down in the D tier. Up next, we have Java, which is probably the most common computer science language I think people use, especially learn. This is a really common first language. This is one of my first languages. The first one, along with C++, that I really dove deep into. When I was in college, almost all the introductory courses are taught in Java. And overall, I think it's a good language. It's a good one to start with. It's really flexible because it's used in so many different applications, and you really can do a lot of things with Java. It gets a lot of flack for being, so verbose and not very concise with its syntax. But overall, I still think that Java is, it's a good language. Tons of applications are still written in Java. So overall, I think it's a really solid choice. Definitely far from perfect, and it does have its limitations. Like, you really can't do things like accessing memory management or pointers, true pointers, I guess you can do there, JVM pointers, which aren't really real pointers, but overall, I think Java's definitely a solid language, gonna find itself in the A tier. Up next, we have Python. Now, this is another language that a lot of people learn as their first language because the syntax is very easy to understand. People often say it reads like English. I wouldn't say it's quite similar to English, but overall, it definitely does have a very understandable, easy to read syntax structure. And, no brackets, no semicolons, so you're not going to get any errors for missing those. Although, I'm of the opinion that I actually think that it's good to start with a language that requires semicolons and brackets, because I think it just builds, good behavior and good practices for computer programming languages. Because if you go from Python to something like Java, C, C++, anything that requires semicolons and brackets, I think it might be a bit more difficult than had you started with one of those languages. That being said, I still think Python is a good one to start with, and it is super flexible. Python over the last few years has really just exploded in popularity, and it's just so easy to do so many different things. There's so many Python packages. I mean, pretty much no matter what project you're working on, Python is an option. It's not always going to be the best option, but pretty much no matter what you're working on, Python is going to be an option. It's definitely not one of the fastest languages, and if you're doing something where you want to be really quick, you probably want to go with something like C++ or C if you don't like C++. But overall, Python, definitely just a super flexible language, really good one to start with, and for that reason, going to find itself in the S tier as well. Up next, we have R, which is a programming language primarily used for statistics and things like that. If you're not using R for statistics, I don't really know what you'd be using it for. I mean, you certainly can use it as just a generic programming language, but you definitely want to be using it for statistics because that's where its biggest strength is at. R is something that's definitely really useful and still used a lot. I have actually seen in recent years Python is kind of catching up in R in terms of how often it's used in statistics. There are a lot of great statistic packages in Python. And even just, if you want to create something like visuals, graphs, things like that, I think Python, you can almost do it easier than you can in R at this point. So I think in the future, we'll probably see Python actually overtake R in the statistics field. R will, I think, always have its place there, but overall, I just think that if I'm doing statistics, I'll usually just go to Python just because it's a bit easier. There's so many packages that do so much for you. So overall, R gonna find itself down in the B tier. Still a good language, but just pretty limited in terms of its use cases. Up next, we have Ruby. Now, if you can believe it, Ruby was actually the first language I ever took a course with. I think it was Code Academy. I took a Ruby course online, and man, I had no idea what I was doing because it was my first exposure to computer science, computer programming. But overall, I think Ruby is actually a decent language to start with. Similar to Python, it's pretty easy to read syntax. You don't need brackets, you don't need semicolons. But overall, it's funny, when I first learned Ruby, this was probably 5, 6, maybe even 7 years ago. A lot of people were saying Ruby is going to be the next big thing. It's going to take over. It's going to be used everywhere. And at the time, it was pretty small use cases. But people really thought it was going to grow. But Ruby, it really did not end up growing as much. It's certainly still used in the industry, but not as much. And I think a lot of the places where people thought that they would be using Ruby, Python ended up kind of taking over. But overall, I still think Ruby is a solid language. And if you want to learn it, certainly go ahead. But I just don't think that you're going to find yourself using it quite as much as you would as something like Python. So Ruby can find itself in the B tier. Up next, we have Swift. Now, this is the language used for Apple's iOS mobile development. And I learned Swift when I wanted to do a little bit of iOS development. But there are some pain points with Swift, mainly that it's not easy to do if you're not writing on a Apple machine. If you're trying to write it on like Windows or Linux, you have a lot of limitations. You have to use like specific programs just to compile your Swift code, and it's really hard to test your application using Swift if you want to test it on a digital mobile device on your computer. And that was a really annoying pain point for a lot of years. Now you can do iOS development using things like C#, so it's not as frustrating as using Swift. And even just syntactically, I'm really not a fan of Swift. I felt like Apple, once again, which I think they do in a lot of places, they were trying too hard to be different with writing Swift. And overall, I'm just really not a huge fan of the syntax. I'm not a huge fan of the way it writes. So Swift actually going to find itself down in the D tier. Definitely the worst way to write mobile applications for me. Not a huge fan of Swift for sure. Up next, we have assembly. Pretty much the backbone of every single programming language if you go back far enough. And honestly, I can't stand assembly. I took a computer science course where everything we did was in assembly, and we had to write huge programs in assembly. We pretty much had 2 assembly program homework assignments all year, and they were huge. The first one was probably like 600-700 lines, and I think my second one was probably 1,500 lines, which, for only 2 assignments all semester, that's not too many lines. But when you're working in assembly, it is horrible. It was completely brutal, and trying to do what we were trying to do in assembly was just so painful. That being said, I still respect assembly. I mean, if you really want to be super efficient, maybe write in assembly. But honestly, if speed is really what you're going for, just write in C or C++. It's probably going to be, just as fast as writing in assembly, especially because most of the time, if you're writing in assembly, you're not going to be writing it as efficiently as you could if you were just writing in C or C++. So assembly definitely had its place back in the day, but in my opinion, there is almost no reason to be writing in assembly unless you're, writing something that needs to be super small. So assembly gonna find itself down in the D tier. Up next, we have a couple scripting languages. We have PowerShell. Now this is one of Windows scripting languages, and overall, I think PowerShell is a decent scripting language. I think the PowerShell integrated scripting environment is actually a decent IDE. It's nice to not have to be writing scripts in a notepad anymore. But overall, PowerShell, you can do a lot of things. There's a lot of really nice, really handy built-in functions. I'm personally not someone who likes to write a lot of scripts, but when I do and I'm on a Windows machine, PowerShell is usually what I'll go for, so it's going to find itself up in the B tier. Up next, we have Bash. Now this is the scripting language used for Linux, and this is one that I certainly used a lot in school as well. And overall, similar to PowerShell, you can do a lot of cool things. There's not quite as many super handy functions built in as there are in PowerShell, but overall, if you're looking to do scripting in Linux, this is really your only choice. I'm not even familiar with any other scripting languages that are popular in Linux, so overall, it's decent, but just not quite as easy to write in as PowerShell for me, so Bash is going to find itself in the C tier. Up next, we're getting into JavaScript. Now, a lot of people kind of hate JavaScript, and I think for good reasons. There's a lot of really quirky, really weird behavioral things in JavaScript. I've experienced them myself doing a lot of web development, and honestly, JavaScript, if you're writing just in straight JavaScript, I'm not really a huge fan. That being said, if you're using a package, I think there's a lot of really great packages for JavaScript that make your life a whole lot easier. Having pre-built functions make things so much easier for you. So if you're doing those, then I think you're in good shape. But if you're just writing straight JavaScript, you might be in for a bad time. But overall, I've written in JavaScript so much at this point that I kind of just embrace the strange behavior and the weird functionality. So definitely wouldn't advise somebody to start with JavaScript as their first programming language. But if you're looking to get into web development, make web pages more interactive, make them more fun, JavaScript definitely a solid choice, and it's actually going to find itself in the A tier for me. Up next, we have HTML and then CSS, which, yes, are not technically programming languages, but I included them here because I think computer programmers, oftentimes, they can usually figure out HTML. They've usually done it before. So overall, I really don't like HTML and CSS. I definitely love doing JavaScript, but in terms of web development, the HTML and CSS is kind of the part where I'm like, okay, I have to do this in order to do the fun part of writing the JavaScript. So HTML is going to find itself in the C tier, and then CSS, I actually kind of despise CSS. It's going to find itself down in the F tier. Trying to do certain things in CSS is just brutal. It's kind of just something I have to do when I'm doing web development, but really do not like CSS. If CSS is your favorite part of web development, I'm sorry, but it is not mine. Up next, we have PHP, F tier. If you need me to elaborate on that, we can have a talk after class. Up next, we have LaTeX. Now this is, once again, really not a computer programming language. It's more of a structuring language like HTML. But honestly, I used LaTeX a whole lot in school, especially, in math when I was writing out proofs, writing out explanations for problems. And honestly, I think it's pretty nice. It's a little bit difficult to learn. It's a little bit quirky when you're first getting used to it. But overall, I think LaTeX is really nice. You can make some really nice looking documents. Making your resume in LaTeX is a great way to do it. You can really make it look good, make it look unique. So LaTeX actually going to find itself in the B tier. Up next, we have MySQL, which is really the only database language that I've used a lot. I have used a couple others briefly, but MySQL is really the main one. And honestly, while they're all a little bit different, they're all pretty much the same, at least from my experience. That being said, I really do not like writing in MySQL. I don't like writing in any database language really, but it's just kind of something you have to do for certain projects. But overall, I still think it's a good language. It's useful for sure. I just don't particularly like writing in it, so it's going to find itself in the C tier. Well, that's my list. Hope you guys enjoyed, and let me know your thoughts.